In the Alter Rebbe shul, he would read the Torah himself. He was the Bal Koreh. One year he was out of town, and somebody else read the Parsha of the curses. The Rebbe's son was at that time 17, 18. And when he heard the curses, he was so affected by it that he fainted. And it weakened him so badly that a month later, when it came Yom Kippur, they had to ask the doctor if it's okay for him to fast. So they asked him, "You've heard that Parsha, you've heard it read many years. How come all of a sudden you're fainting?" It describes Jewish suffering, terrible, terrible, page after page. But you've heard it before. How come all of a sudden you're fainting? So he said, when my father reads it, it sounds like blessings. So this was the first time that he heard it, that it sounded like curses. When you hear your father, then no matter what he says, it sounds like blessings. To children, what you say is not as important as how you say it. So sometimes you can tell a child criticism, that you're angry, and they love it. And sometimes you give them a compliment and they hate you. It all depends on how you do it. Children don't understand adults. Naturally, makes sense. So when an adult speaks to a child, the child tunes out. But when a parent speaks to a child, that's not only good, it's a blessing. So you have to sound like a parent, never like an adult. What is the difference? So there's another story of the previous Rebbe, the Friedman Rebbe. He came home one day from Cheder when he was a young boy, 4 or 5 years old, and he asked his father, "Why do we have 2 eyes? We have only 1 nose, 1 mouth. Why do we have 2 eyes?" So his father thought about it. This is how he tells the story. His father thought about it, and then he asked him, "Do you know the difference between the letter Shin and the letter Sin?" He said, "Yes. The letter Shin has a dot on the right side, and the letter Sin has a dot on the left side." So his father said to him, "The 2 dots, those are the 2 eyes. When the dot's on the right side, then it's a strong sound, Shin. When the dot's on the left side, then it's soft, Sin. The right eye, the strong eye, you look at another Jew. The left eye, you look at candy. Candies. So the Rebbe writes that answer affected him so deeply that from then on, his love for every Jew was opened up, and his interest in candy went down. When I read this as a teenager, I asked one of my teachers, How come it had such an effect? If you try, call your children and say to them, do you know why we have two eyes? The right eye is the strong eye, and the left eye is the weak eye, and the right eye you look at another Jew, and the left eye you look at candy. You think it's going to have an effect? Your kid is going to wait till you're finished, and he's going to say, can I go now? Why did it have such an effect on the Rebbe? So of course you can say, well, he was a Rebbe. He was still 4 years old, but he was a Rebbe. Sensitive soul, whatever. No? My teacher said to me, do you think that his father came up with the answer at that moment? Why does the Rebbe tell the story and he says that his father thought about it? Why is that important? His father's answer was something that the father wanted to tell him already for a long time. And he was waiting for the right moment. What does it mean that one eye is strong and one eye is weak? Scientifically, biologically, why do we have two eyes? Depth perception. One eye is strong, it sees further. One eye is weak, it sees closer. So you get a sense of depth. Close, deep, shallow. The Rebbe was saying to him, the reason you have two eyes is that you should know the difference between something deep and something shallow. For example, a Jew and a candy. His father wanted to tell him this already for a long time, that not all things are equal. Some things are deep, some things are shallow. But he was waiting for the right moment. When his son came home and asked why we have two eyes, the Rebbe put the message as an answer to that question. But it was something he wanted to tell him anyway. What we learn from this is two things. First of all, when he gave that answer, he sounded like a father, not like an adult. Why? An adult does not prepare what he's going to say to a child. If a child is sitting next to an adult in shul and he's not behaving, the adult will say something. It's not prepared. It's not thought over. Only a father or a mother would have something they want to tell the child and they're waiting for the right minute. In other words, a father says to the child what he already prepared, premeditated, intentional, with a plan. You see that the child needs to hear something, needs to learn something, so you prepare how you're going to say it, and then when you say it, you don't sound like an adult, you sound like a parent. Somebody asked a while ago, is it okay to spank your child? I said, sure. But you have to make a list now. What are you going to spank your child for? Make a list and put it on the refrigerator. When you get angry at your child, check the list. If it's not on the list, you can't spank him. So the people sat there thinking, and then they said, can't think of anything to put on the list. When you're not angry, when you're in a good mood, what are you going to spank your child for? What could be so terrible you have to spank him? Only when you get upset and angry, all of a sudden, it makes sense to spank. So always with a premeditated plan. That's the first thing. The second thing we learn from it is that no matter how smart, no matter how good your message is, if it's not the right time and it's not the right setting, you're wasting your time. No, it's worse than wasting time. Your child gets used to not listening to you. When you say things that don't have a positive effect, it's training the child to tune you out. They don't listen. That's why you never tell a child what they should do or shouldn't do when they're upset, crying, angry, because they're not listening. So if you speak to them when they're upset, you're just reinforcing their ability to tune you out. So as soon as you start talking, they switch off, even though you're saying something beautiful. So this is what we learn from the story. The Rebbe wanted to tell his son something about deep and shallow. He waited. For what? For a moment when the child is most receptive. When is the child most receptive? When they ask a question. Like by the Seder. How do you tell your children the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim? First get them to ask a question, or 4 questions. Then they're listening. Then what you say will have a powerful effect. So, if you see your child do something wrong, and you want to say something, wait. Wait. At least a few hours, or a day, depending on the age of the child. Can you imagine? You're sitting by the table, eating dinner. Everybody's in a good mood. Everybody is enjoying. And you turn to your 10-year-old and you say, you know, yesterday, when you did what you did, not good. That's not right. You're not supposed to do that. Your child's reaction is going to be so positive. You're criticizing. They love it. Why? You remember what I did yesterday? You've been thinking about it all day? It's such a compliment. I was on your mind since yesterday? You noticed what I did? That's sounding like a parent. So, rule number 1 in disciplining children, don't discipline when they're misbehaving. Discipline when they're in a good mood, when they're enjoying their dinner. You ruin their appetite, but you tell them something good, and they will hear it, and it will change them. You know, we live in Minnesota. Getting ready for school in the morning takes a long time. You have to put on your snowsuit, you have to put on your boots, you have to put on your mittens, you have to put on the scarf, you have to put on the hat, and usually the boots are wet from yesterday, so the shoe doesn't slide in. It's hard to get the shoe into the boot. So we invented a whole system. You put a plastic bag on the shoe, and then you slide it into the boot. So one morning, my 8-year-old was trying to get his shoe into the boot, and it was not going. And it's late, the bus is coming. So he's getting a little frustrated, and I hear him say from the front door, I hear him say, I can't get the stupid shoe into the boot. So I said, if the shoe is stupid, I don't mind, as long as the person wearing it is not stupid. 4 days later, his friend was over, they were playing, and the friend said, they were making a puzzle, and the friend said, I can't get this stupid piece to fit in. And my son said, The peace is okay if it's stupid, as long as the person who's doing it is not. When they hear you, it lasts. It becomes part of their life. It becomes part of their thinking. So, rule number 1, don't discipline when you catch a child red-handed doing something wrong. Wait. 2 things. When you wait, when you talk about it the next day, it's without anger. You're not reacting. You're not threatening because you're not threatened. You're calm. Number 2, you've had time to think how you want to say it. So always discipline when a child is in a good mood, which means when they're listening. Otherwise, who are you talking to? Rule number 2. Don't discipline bad behavior. That's like a policeman. Nobody likes policemen. Discipline good behavior. Every child needs discipline. But who says it has to be when they misbehave? Why not when they do behave? For example, a sergeant in the army. The sergeant is training the soldiers. What does he discipline? Bad behavior? No. If the soldier doesn't behave, the sergeant calls the military police and take him away. The sergeant is not going to deal with bad behavior. What does a sergeant do? The sergeant says, polish your boots. If you don't polish your boots, he calls the police, take them away. But if you do polish your boots, the sergeant comes and looks at it and says, this is called polished? Start all over again and do it right. The sergeant says, stand at attention. If you don't, he calls the police. If you do, he says, that's called standing at attention. Stand up straight. He's disciplining good behavior. So, for example, you tell a child, before he eats the cookie, make a bracha. The child says, Baruch atah you say, good, thank you. No, not good. That's how you make a bracha. Start again. Say every word. The child is going to make the bracha, but first he puts the cookie in his mouth. Then he makes the bracha with the cookie in his mouth. You say, okay, fine, he made the bracha. Good. No. Discipline good behavior. It's interesting. Nobody likes a policeman. But everybody appreciates the sergeant who trained him in the army. Not right away. When they look back years later, they appreciate. The sergeant made a mensch out of me. So instead of always criticizing and disciplining bad behavior, discipline good behavior. Interesting, if you discipline good behavior, the bad behavior disappears. Not always, but in many. So I heard this little piece of wisdom that you got to remember, especially if you're a grandparent, you'll appreciate this. The piece of wisdom says like this: if you raise your children, then you can spoil your grandchildren. But if you spoil your children, you're going to have to raise your grandchildren. Is that the whole story of life right there in one sentence? If you raise your children, then your grandchildren don't need you to raise them, so you spoil them. I was driving in a car, California, with my 7-year-old granddaughter. She was sitting in the back, and she said, I want to have a Slurpee. You know a Slurpee? I said, okay, we'll stop at the store, we'll get. She said, Mommy doesn't let. I said, I'm Mommy's tati. I'm a grandfather. My job is to spoil you, so we'll stop and we'll get you a Slurpee. And this 7-year-old said, you know, just because you want something doesn't mean you have to have it. I don't talk to her anymore. She's too smart for me. Somebody raised her well. Now I can spoil her. But if she hadn't been raised well, I would have to tell her, just because you want something doesn't mean you have to have it. So raising your child has benefits. The benefit is you can spoil your grandchildren. What does it mean to raise a child? Isn't it a little strange expression? You raise cattle. You raise wheat. What does it mean to raise a child? And this is really crucial. What do you want from the child? I remember being confused growing up. We would finish a meal, and my mother would say, take the plate to the sink. Be a mensch. So I thought, oh, a mensch is someone who washes dishes. That's a mensch. But then my friend came over, and I didn't give him a candy or ask him if he wants a candy, and my mother says, offer him a candy, be a mensch. I said, wait a minute, I'm not washing dishes. So what's a mensch? It just kept on going. This, be a mensch. That, be a mensch. What in the world is a mensch? What do we want from our children? We make them crazy. Raising children literally means take them from where they are and raise them up a step. In what? In what gives them pleasure. Every child is born with pleasure. What is the pleasure of a baby? Taste and touch. That is the lowest of the 5 senses. You want to raise your child means introduce a higher pleasure. Not take away pleasure. Introduce a higher pleasure. For example, the pleasure of music. Why do we sing to our children? We don't sing to anybody else, but we sing to our children. Because we want to introduce, you had something to eat, you put everything in your mouth. That's nice. But you want to see something nicer? Here's a tune. It's more pleasure. It's a greater pleasure. It's a more edel pleasure. And you know when we sing? At the table. When they're enjoying the lower pleasure, we introduce the higher pleasure. Don't just eat. Introduce something a little better, higher, more refined, more elegant. So raising children means introduce a higher form of pleasure. After we introduce music, what's the next step up? Good character. You ever read a book to your child about somebody who did something very, very special? The child's eyes light up. His face lights up. Read it again. Let's read it again. The pleasure that comes from good character is a greater, deeper, more intense pleasure than eating and touching. It's also higher than sound, which is music. What's the next step up? The next step up is intelligence. When a child figures out a puzzle or a riddle, or you ask a question and the child knows the answer, do you see the pleasure that that gives the child? Greater than all the other pleasures. But you have to cultivate it. You have to encourage it. And you have to go in that order. Because what happens if you cultivate the pleasure of intelligence in a child, but you didn't cultivate the pleasure of good character? So the child doesn't get excited about somebody who did something kind, somebody who did something selfless, he did something really helpful. That he doesn't enjoy, but he enjoys intelligence. You might have a brilliant little monster. So no skipping steps. What is the next step up? The next step up is the pleasure in serving God. So you got to climb the ladder that stands on earth but reaches into heaven. And that ladder is the ladder of pleasure. That's called raising children. So, number one, sound like a parent, not like an adult. How do you do that? Prepare what you want to say. Think ahead. What does the child need to hear or learn next? Number two, wait for the right minute. Make sure that your child is listening to you when you speak. Too many times you hear parents saying to their children, "Are you listening? Did you hear what I said?" That means the child has tuned you out a long time ago and you know it. Why did he tune you out? You talked to him when he wasn't listening. So you're just noise in the background. Do not say anything to a child, or nothing serious, when you know they're not listening. It just creates a bad habit. Number three, don't always discipline bad behavior. Sometimes you make believe you didn't see. Discipline good behavior. They appreciate it, and it's more effective. And then you may not have to discipline bad behavior because it won't happen. And then raise your child. Climb the ladder of low pleasure to higher pleasure. The previous Rebbe was very gifted in writing. Even as a young child, he could tell a story and make it so alive that his teacher, when he was 9 years old, noticed this talent, and he encouraged him to keep a diary. Obviously, growing up in the house of a Rebbe, and your grandfather is a Rebbe, you have a lot of stories to tell that nobody else has. So his teacher encouraged him to keep a diary. And he did, from the age of 9. And then after he became a Rebbe, he published parts of that diary. So we have many stories about his childhood that is fascinating insight into how a Rebbe grows up. The previous Rebbe. So here's one of the stories he has in his diary. His father, the Rebbe Rashab, was constantly fighting with the Tsar to stop pogroms and to protect the rights of Jews. Very often, he had to be out of the country to bring foreign pressure on the Tsar to do. So he would go to Germany, he would go to France. So the Rebbe, his son, grew up with his father out of town a lot. So when he was 5, 6, 7, his father was out of town, out of the country. So he writes in his diary, he's 9 years old, and he says how terrible he felt all those years when all his friends would go to shul with their father and he would have to go alone. He was also an only child. Then his father stopped traveling so much. And his father said to him, I'm going to be home more, so now I'm taking over your education. Any questions you have, come to me. So the Rebbe writes in his diary, my father's attention and devotion to me was so good, it was so sweet, that it erased the pain of the dark years. He's a 9-year-old. So here's one of the stories. After his father stopped traveling a lot, and he was really enjoying his father's attention, there was one Shabbos that his parents were going to their dacha. And his father said to him, ask your teacher if it's okay for you to come with us or you'll miss too much school and it's not a good idea. So he asked his teacher, Reb Nissen, and Reb Nissen said it's not a good idea. We're doing a difficult piece of Mishnah and you have to be here. So he went back and he told his father that Reb Nissen said that it's not a good idea for him to go. And his father said, I agree. Reb Nissen was one of his favorite teachers. Anyway, Friday or Thursday, the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin got into the kareta, and they were leaving, and he was standing in front of the house. He was 7 years old. He started to cry. But then he thought to himself, my teacher is the best teacher I've ever had, and he says I shouldn't go. My father is a Rebbe and a tzaddik, and everything he does is wise and holy, and he says I shouldn't go. To my mother, I'm an only child, and she says I shouldn't go. So why am I crying? He stopped crying, and he decided that he is going to study better those couple of days than ever before. So again, I remember reading this as a teenager, and I said to my teacher, that's not fair. How can a 7-year-old be so mature? Come on. I'm 17, I'm not that mature. Another story. The Rebbe's ability to describe events came from a good imagination, the ability to picture. So when he was in Cheder, his teacher, particularly Reb Nissen, would tell him a story at the end of every day, if they were good. If they didn't behave, there was no story. And they never wanted to miss a story. So every day, when he would come home, he would go directly to his grandfather's room, the Rebbe Marash, which was left intact after he passed away. So there was a desk and a chair and a big recliner or a stuffed chair. Nobody used the room, so when he would come home, he would go into that room, he would climb onto this big chair, and he would close his eyes, and he would picture the story that the Rebbe told, his teacher told him that day. He would imagine it all. He would draw a picture of it. One time he came home. He went into the room. He climbed into the chair. He closed his eyes, and he started picturing the story. What was the story? Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who wrote the Mishnah, when he died, he came to heaven, and they asked him, "You deserve everything, so you get to choose. What do you want as a reward?" And Rabbi Yehuda said, "I want to come every Friday night to my house and make Kiddush for my family." So every Friday night, his neshama came back to earth. He went home to his family, and he made Kiddush for them. So now, the 7-year-old boy is sitting in this chair, and he's imagining. Neshama comes down from heaven. He looks in the window. He sees the Shabbos table, the white tablecloth, the candles. He goes in. He says, "Good Shabbos." He makes Kiddush. He's picturing this whole thing. All of a sudden, he hears talking. He opens his eyes, and he sees his father, the Rebbe Rashab, is standing on the far side of the desk, facing the chair, his grandfather's chair. His father is wearing his Shabbos clothes with a gartel. He's talking, and he's crying. He's talking to the grandfather. Now, if you saw that, how would you react? His father is talking to his grandfather who had already passed away. How would you react? So he writes in his diary, "I realized that I probably shouldn't be in the room right then, so I walked out." He was not shocked. He was not overwhelmed. He was used to it. Neshama, you come, you go, you talk to your grandfather. He's there. He's at his chair. He's at his desk. It's a completely different life, huh? Another story. When his grandfather passed away, he left a will. In the will, he asked that none of his children should go into business. For some reason, one of the sons, Reb Zalman Aaron, bought a forest. He invested in lumber. He bought a forest. And he cut the tree, to cut the trees and make lumber. His father, meaning the Rebbe Rashab, was very, very hurt that his brother had violated the will. So one day, the Rebbe came home. He was a young boy. He came home, and he went into his mother's room, and he found her crying. She was knitting, and she was crying. He said, "Mama, why are you crying?" She said, "You're too young to understand." So he went to an older chassid, and the chassid told him that the mother is crying because the father is very upset that the brother bought a forest against the grandfather's wishes. The mother was worried that this is going to harm her husband's health because the Rebbe had a heart condition. So the mother is crying that the father shouldn't suffer. The father was in the middle of a farbrengen. When he heard this, he went into the room where there's a Farbrengen. The room was so crowded he couldn't get through. But when they noticed it's the Rebbe's son, they picked him up and they passed him over the head, one to the other, and they carried him to the front of the room and they sat him down next to the Rebbe. One of the famous Chassidim was sitting there, so he gave him a little cup to say l'chaim. And the Rebbe refused. So his father looked at him like, why are you refusing? What's the matter? So he whispered to his father that his teacher told him that if there's cake on the table and a drink on the table, you have to make a bracha on the cake first. So his father was very pleased, and he gave him a piece of cake, and then he said l'chaim. Then he leaned over to his father, and he said, Mommy is crying. So his father said to him, go back and tell Mommy that my headache went away. I'm feeling better, and the Farbrengen is going to end soon. Not going to Farbrengen too long. They picked him up, they carried him back, and they put him down. He went into the mother and said, Tati said, it's okay. And then he said, and I promise you, I don't know if he was 9 years old, he says, I promise you, I will never do anything to make Tati worry. One final story. The previous Rebbe, unlike the other Rebbes, was arrested not once, not twice, not 3 times, 5 times. The first time he was arrested, he was 12 years old. He was walking in the street, and he saw a policeman dragging an old Jew to jail. Without thinking for a second, he jumped on the policeman and started punching him. When the Rebbe told the story, he said, you understand what a policeman meant in those days? You were afraid to walk on the same side of the street. But Avas Yisrael, he saw the old Jew being beaten, he jumped on the policeman. So the policeman took him to jail. It's a long story, but they found out that he is a Schneerson, and they let him go. That was the first time. 5 times. And each time became more and more serious. So my wife's grandfather was very close with the previous Rebbe. And he was also a very real, deep, profound chassid, but he was very funny. He had a fantastic sense of humor. When the Rebbe came to America, the previous Rebbe, he was suffering from MS. So his speech was a little difficult, his writing was difficult. So there was one particular day when the people saw that the Rebbe is too serious. So they called my wife's grandfather, Rabbi Yochanan, and they said, come to the house. Maybe you can do something. So they're sitting by the table and they're eating. And the Rebbe is in the middle of, and suddenly Rabbi Yochanan says to the Rebbe, you know, sitting in jail for Yiddishkeit once is a big mitzvah. Twice, that's already beyond the letter of the law. 3 times, unbelievable. 5 times, what are you, showing off? The Rebbe laughed so hard, the fork fell out of his hand. Okay, just to summarize quickly. If you want to raise your children properly, introduce higher pleasures one step at a time. Do it with premeditated message. Think what you need to tell your child, not when he upsets you, but when he's in a good mood and you're in a good mood. Discipline good behavior, not bad behavior. One time the Rebbe Rashab called in his son, the Friedman Rebbe, and he said to him, I noticed this morning when your friend was over at the house, you shared your candy with him. But I saw that you weren't doing it with your whole heart. And he explained to him the difference between doing something because you have to or doing something with your whole heart. A perfect example. It's not that he didn't share. It wasn't bad behavior. It was good behavior, but it needed a little disciplining. That's how we raise good children. That's how we raise healthy children. That's how we raise children who appreciate being raised, who will praise you and thank you for the rest of their lives. They will quote you. And by the way, you should quote your parents. You should tell your children the wisdom that you got from your parents, even if you didn't. If you have to make it up, make it up. Anything smart you think of, say my mother told me. Connect your children to their grandparents, to their great-grandparents. The children have to know life didn't begin when they were born. There's more to life, so you make a bigger picture. Then, when you're going to be a grandparent, or even after 120 years, they will be quoting you. Hopefully they won't have to make something up. Thank you.